Well, it is my great pleasure to be able to have a conversation with Joe Marino, who has been I think, a courageous researcher involving the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin is a topic which I became interested in pretty intensively over the past year and a half, 2 years. Although I remember it when I was a young man, I remember the results published in 1981 by the Shroud Research Project. And then I remember, if not long afterwards, in 1988, something about the carbon dating and the controversy that sort of was sparked by that. But just to begin with, so my listeners know the Shroud of Turin is a linen burial cloth that is 14 and 4 inches long by 3 and 7 inches wide, or something like that. And on the shroud is an image of a man who was apparently crucified, crowned with thorns, pierced in his side, and in all respects resembles the person we've come to know as Jesus of Nazareth. Now, there's been a great deal of controversy, allegations that it's a fraud and whatnot. In 1978, the Shroud of Turin Research Project spent, I think, 5 days continuously, 24 hours a day, researching every aspect of this uh, artifact, and it is probably the most studied artifact in the history of the world. And Joe Marino has been one of the chief contributors to this research. And I've included him in my profiles in courage because he it takes courage to go against the grain, particularly as has been viewed as something impregnable and unquestionable, and science pronounced that the shroud was a forgery in 1988 via carbon dating. But Joe's work uh, beautifully really put the lie to that. So before we begin talking about the shroud, and by the way, I've included to my over my shoulder an image of the shroud from one of Vernon Miller's photographs in 1978 that I've had made for myself to remind us of what we're talking about. Um, and every time I look at that picture, I have to say it sends a shiver through me.
Mm.
It's unbelievable. So, Joe, tell us in your words a little bit about yourself, and we'll just take it from there and let it fly.
All right. Well, my name is Joe Marino, and I've been studying the shroud for over 48 years now. And like you, that face, when I saw that on a copy of my first book that I ever saw on the shroud in 1977, just captivated me. And I've been writing and researching and lecturing for most of those 48 years. And I've written two books on the shroud, hundreds of articles, well, over 100. And it really keeps my attention. I know I'll be doing it the rest of my life. I find it the most fascinating um, object on the planet, and I do believe it is um, the most intensely studied artifact in human history. No, skeptics. No, anything I say today, someone will try to contest. So I'm not going to
Okay,
stop
yeah.
every time and say so and so will say this to what I just said. But
No.
just know that there are skeptics out there, and about the only thing that skeptics and proponents agree on is that there's a linen cloth in Turin called the Shroud of Turin. Everything else is pretty much contested by one side or the other based on what each side says. Um, I'm currently the excuse me, president and of Stera Inc., which is the Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association, which was run by Barry Schwartz, who was the documenting photographer for the Shroud in 1978. And Barry formed Stera back in, I think, 2009. It started
Hmm.
nonprofit organization, and it has the website shroud.com, of which I'm now also the editor. Uh,
That's a big
Barry just
job.
did,
That's a huge job, isn't it, Joe? I mean,
it is,
I mean, my gosh, it's a
it is.
load mine. It's a mine. of treasure
But
trove.
I have six other board members besides myself, that which are all of them are great people to have literally on board. Um, and they're helping me navigate the storms that we're currently going through. But yeah, unfortunately, I had intended to get out to Barry's house. Um, what was it? Starting, I guess, the fall of 2023, to see what he actually did. The nuts and bolts of the organization, because I only had a cursory idea. And because the board said, somebody ought to go out there and see what he does in case, Barry's not going to last forever.
Yeah.
And as it turns out, we delayed it a couple times, and then he got sick in April of 2024, and I was never able to make it out there. So I'm still learning some ropes. I think I basically got a handle on most of the things, but it is a big job. But Barry's work was just so important. He's been missed terribly already. I personally miss him uh, a ridiculous amount. We used to talk 2 and 3 times a week, and
Oh, how
it just
beautiful.
seems strange looking at my phone and never seeing Barry Schwartz on the caller ID anymore. Um,
And Joe, I've only known Barry through the videos he's done and through some email exchanges I've had. He just struck me as such a beautiful guy. And he talked that he has a great story about how he got involved in STURP, the
yeah,
Shroud of Turin Research Project. He's a Jew, he's Jewish. I forget who asked him, but he said, "What do you? I don't. Jesus is not my thing. I'm a Jew basically."
hmm
And he went along for the vacation to Turin,
hmm
and he ended up devoting his life to the shroud.
yes,
Uh, and I think he was even agnostic at the time. I'm not so sure. He was raised Orthodox, but I think he was agnostic when he was first approached. I'm not sure about that.
yeah. He did his bar mitzvah and was sort of discouraged with organized religion,
Yep.
including his own, and just kind of became a secular Jew basically until and then he wasn't interested in becoming involved with the shroud really at first because it was obviously a Christian relic, and he was intrigued by the image because that was his area of expertise. He and everybody else on STURP wanted to know how that image got on the cloth, and he really didn't want to join. And Don Lynn, um, of the STURP team, who's also gone. There's only 12 members of STURP left now.
Is that true? Out of how
Um,
many? How many were
you
there
know,
initially?
uh, there were about 30 of the scientists went over to Turin
Right.
um, in 1978.
And we're talking about
And
people from Los Alamos, Sandia
yeah,
Labs, the Jet Propulsion Lab. We're talking about very
exactly.
serious scientists. I mean, and I think one of them even said, "Listen, we're going to go over. I'll disprove it in
Mm,
10 minutes. Just relax. Let's
yeah,
do our thing." They ended up coming back with, I know there are
mm,
many books about this, and you can talk about it if you'd like, but they did such an exhaustive analysis, and everything they did, they could not
yeah,
illuminate how this image was made. It was not made by the hand of man. It is not not pigmented. It is not dyed. It is not painted.
yeah,
In fact, it is a very faint image that's on the very upper layers. I don't know if you call them layers, are so
right,
fine of the linen cloth that with the naked eye you can't see if you're within 8 feet of it because it's so
right.
faint. But then in 1898, a photographer, Secondo Pia, took an image of the shroud. I think it was in Turin, the cathedral,
hmm
and St. John's Cathedral, I think. Anyway, took an image of the
St. John the
shroud,
Baptist.
St.
Yep.
John the Baptist, yeah. He went home, he developed the negatives, and when the negatives, which is what you'll see over my shoulder, it's a negative image, showed this incredible detail. And that, I mean, that to me is one of the great, if this is a forgery, Joe, tell me how somebody in 1423 or 1516 could have devised a method to create a negative image like this on a cloth like that, etc. So that to me is one of the like major milestones in the
Yeah.
whole shroud issue. Um, but tell me a little bit about the Sturp and their investigation and your summary of it, if you want to.
Well, Barry was actually one of those guys that thought, he'd find he'd pull out his little microscope and or optical device rather, and what he always carried with him in those days. And he thought within 5 minutes he'd see the paint and say, "Well, we got a trip to Italy out of it." But
Right.
he didn't find anything that suggested that it was a forgery of any kind. And so the main focus of Sturp was to try to find out how that image got on the shroud.
Right.
And they spent, as you said, 5 days around the clock in 1978, and then spent 3 years collating the data, writing many peer-reviewed articles, and in 1981 wrote a summary report and concluded that there was real blood on the shroud. There was no artistic substance on it that could account for the image. They actually worded it saying it is not the product of an artist, and until another group of scientists, either them or another group, it remains a mystery, and that holds true to this day. Um, Sturp is often accused of being religious nuts, which is ridiculous because these guys, as you mentioned, all those labs that they're affiliated with, um, they sent men into space. They worked on nuclear programs. These were not religious guys. These were hardcore scientists. Now, some of them were Christians,
Yeah.
but there were also Jews
Right.
and Barry. There was three others besides Barry. There were Mormons on the group, agnostics. Um, but to say that they were religious fanatics is just crazy. And the reason I think skeptics concluded that is that they wanted Sturp to find out that it was a forgery and state that, but they followed where the evidence took them, and they couldn't explain it. They spent about, what was it, 17 months preparing to go over there. They did a dry run in the United States. They constructed a table to hold the shroud, which was constructed at a cost of about $20,000.
My gosh.
They were very careful not to harm the shroud in any way. They had to do all non-destructive testing, which they did. Um, so they were very careful in their testing, and they were very respectful. And they used gloves when they were examining it and stuff. But then they were all thrilled when at the very end the Archbishop, the Cardinal Balestrero, said to them, "You've all been so respectful this whole time. I'm going to let you touch it with your bare hands."
Oh,
So a lot of
really?
them, yeah, they all did that, which was pretty cool. Um,
And
so
and
they
I want
were,
to bring I want to bring up
yeah,
two things about this group. I mean, this is I mean, 17 months in preparation. This is a lot of time, Joe, right? I mean, these guys are serious, right?
yeah,
I've seen the pictures, I've read accounts. I just recently read Russ Briel's book, Shroud Encounter, by the way,
hmm
which I thought was a great, excellent summary of everything. And Father Rinaldi, was he not an instrumental
oh
player in
yes.
this? Um,
Father Rinaldi was actually he was vice president of the Holy Shroud Guild in Bronx, New York, but he was actually born in Turin and saw the shroud as an altar boy in the 1930s, and he was a Salesian priest, and he was actually assigned to the United States and became pastor of Corpus Christi Church in Port Chester, New York.
mhm.
Became vice president of the Holy Shroud Guild, and he was really the liaison between the Sturp scientists and the Turin authorities. And so Father Rinaldi was actually a dual citizen, so he was the perfect person to have in place. One of the most interesting stories is that when Sturp sent over their equipment. I think it's 70 crates or something. One of the crates had a radiation sticker because, for x-rays and stuff.
Yeah.
And so the Italian authorities impounded all of the equipment and wouldn't let Stirp have it to set up. They went like a week early to be able to set up,
Yeah.
and the Turin authorities, or the customs people, uh, kept the equipment away from Stirp, and Father Rinaldi had to intervene, and the Archbishop basically hawked the cathedral to get the equipment released. So I would say without Father Rinaldi, that testing would have never happened.
That's incredible. Well, hats off to Father Rinaldi. I mean, and again, you have to say again, he's someone. A lot of people may say, well, a lot of Catholics perhaps may say, well, the shroud is not really instrumental to our faith, and whether it's real or not real is immaterial. Apparently, Rinaldi believed that science should be allowed to examine this, yet he was
Mm-hmm.
fearless in that way. And in the same way that I think you have been as well. You're a man of faith, you're fearless in what you've been doing. And again, if something's real, well, nothing's better than the truth. So you got nothing to be afraid of.
Yeah.
I think that was the attitude he went into this thing with. But there's a beautiful photo. I don't know how to bring this stuff up on the screen yet with Zoom. I'll learn someday. But there's that great photo. I think it was on the pic on the cover of Time magazine where one of the
Mm.
researchers is peering up under the shroud, and
Oh
the
yeah.
scientists are behind him. I think Barry took that one,
Yeah.
and
Barry
it's
took
just
that.
yeah, and it's just
Mm.
phenomenal. And that the fact that these people worked 24 hours a day, night
Mm.
and day, unbelievable, 5 days,
Yeah.
24 hours a day, right?
Yeah. Barry. I think they were there for like 100. What was the figure? Something like 122 hours, and Barry was up for like 108 of them,
My
which
gosh.
I don't know how he could get by with so little sleep. But I mean,
Yeah,
he must have been going on adrenaline the whole week, because
yeah.
that seems almost inhuman to be able to do that.
They had
um,
that one window, and apparently that the time the shroud was owned was it King Umberto,
Correct.
right? And
It
now
was
it's
not owned by the church at that time.
owned by
Yes.
the church, and now it's passed into the papacy. I think the Pope, whoever the Pope is, we don't have a Pope yet, but I guess we're going to
Yeah.
get one soon. Is the nominal owner of the shroud, and I understand the shroud has not been exhibited for quite a while, by the way, and it's not slated. I thought it was going to be exhibited this year, but something has come up. Do you know anything about that, Joe?
Yeah. 2015 was the last time it was exhibited, and then they promised shortly thereafter that it would probably be exhibited this year for the Holy Year.
Yeah,
Um, and in the meantime, some conservationists advised them that they thought that exposing the shroud for the exhibitions, public exhibitions, was harming the shroud in terms of the weight on it and stuff like that, and it was
right.
stretching the cloth and whatnot. And so I think that was the main reason they they decided not to show it. I read it for the first time. I forget where I saw it, but they said I think it was an article in the Italian press that said it's very possible that the shroud will never ever be publicly exhibited again. They did have a virtual exhibition where you could go in tour and you could sign up and get a virtual tour, but that's as close as probably people are going to get anymore.
That's incredible. Well, I'd like to ask you, Joe, tell me about your first acquaintance with the Shroud mystery, your feelings, and then we'll go from there, if you would.
Okay. Well, I was in 1977. I was out of high school for about 5 years, and I had worked for the federal government uh, since 1974, and I was reading a lot about um, religion and philosophy at the time, not just Christian. I was born and raised uh, Christian, but became agnostic in high school,
Hmm.
and but I was still reading a lot of religion and philosophical writings, and I would always go to uh, the religion section of a bookstore when I would go there. So in I can remember the month and year was March 1977. I went to a bookstore, went to the religion section, and saw a paperback which had a picture of the negative, like it's over your shoulder. Had that on the cover, and it said, "Is this the face of Jesus Christ?" Um, it was called the Fifth Gospel.
Hmm.
Subtitle is just the face of Jesus Christ. And I thought, well, this looks like interesting reading. I had never heard of the Shroud. I had heard of Veronica's Veil, which is a legend, probably a legend, because it's not in the Gospels. In the Catholic devotion of the Stations of the Cross, there's uh, one of the stations is the Veronica wipes the face of Jesus.
Yes.
And that could very well be a story made up to explain having the shroud, which was probably folded up so that only the face was showing at one time. Because, 14 and a half feet long and 3.5 feet wide is a big cloth to carry around unfolded. So
Yeah.
it kind of makes sense that it was probably folded up for ease of carry and maybe even just to maybe show the most prominent part of the image, which is the face. Um, so the the face that's the Veronica legend is probably there, as I say, to explain um, how we have the image on the shroud. So I bought the book, brought it home, read it in one sitting, and was just absolutely fascinated by it. And that was about year and a half before Stirp went over
Now, Joe,
to
is this
study the
Ian
shroud.
Wilson's book? Was this Ian Wilson's
No, the
book?
book it was by a man named Thomas Humber,
Okay.
um, and he rewrote the book later and called this retitled it the Sacred Shroud
Okay.
because there was kind of a bizarre German guy that also wrote a book called the Fifth Gospel, and he didn't want the two to be confused,
Okay.
so
Gotcha.
he wrote an updated version and renamed it. Um, so I started looking in the bibliography and getting all the books and articles that were available at that time, and there wasn't really much at all in the United States that you could easily get your hands on. I mean, the Holy Shroud Guild did exist, and you could get pictures and slides and that sort of thing, but there weren't really a lot of books and articles on the shroud at that time. Um, but I started collecting any articles and books that I could. Now the one book that most people or one of the books that people might be familiar with in the United States is called A Doctor at Calvary, which came out I think in the 50s in the United States. It was written by a French surgeon named Pierre Barbet. I
Okay.
think it was originally done in the 30s or updated probably in the 50s and then released in English. And a lot of people read that book at some point, especially during Lent. Um, and so I started looking for any material I could find on it. I did write the Holy Shroud Guild. Um, Later got some slides, which I later started to use when I started lecturing.
And then Joe,
Um,
Joe, let me interrupt for 1 second now. Were you still agnostic at the time?
yes, I was.
Okay.
Um, but that reading about the shroud actually, I would say, brought me back to my Christian roots. And I eventually ended up joining a monastery in 1980. And with the slides that I had gotten from the Holy Shroud Guild, I started lecturing in the St. Louis area, which is my hometown and the city where the monastery was that I had joined. Um, and then I started writing the scientists, and I went to my first Shroud conference in 1986. Met Jackson and Jumper from Stirp,
Oh, right, yes.
and also Dr. Gilbert Lavoie and Paul Maloney.
And may I
Uh,
interrupt you for one stop you once that these
sure.
names are ringing a bell now. Jackson and Jumper, were they not the men who produced that V8 image and analysis, that green kind
Right.
of three-dimensional image through their processor that was designed to do like lunar surfaces or whatever?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. They were the co-founders of Stirp, and they did the VP8 image analyzer, which converts a brightness into a vertical map. And
right.
they were shocked to see that the image came out spatially encoded in the proper proportion. People generally call it 3D.
Yeah.
Technically, it's called spatial encoding. I'm not sure it's a true 3D is the accurate term, but that's what people use a lot. But anyway, it is accurately embedded spatial encoding from that device. And if you put any other um, picture in that device, it comes out distorted, but the
Right.
Shroud does not. So
And this
that's what
image
got
and
Stirp
this image
interested.
is on the shroud.com. I mean, for people listening, all of this material is I think is on shroud.com. You can get that image. It's sort of a greenish image that like a bas relief. Um, and that history is there. So I want people to be able to go and see that for themselves. If
Mm-hmm.
I could bring it up, I'd bring it up. I don't know how to do it yet, Joe. I apologize
Okay,
on the
it's
computer.
okay.
But yeah, but that was another thing. That's another, these photographic anomalies. You have an
Mm-hmm.
image that can only be seen in detail when it's converted into a negative. And then you have a quasi three-dimensional image that emerges from the two-dimensional data. These are anomalous. And as you say,
Mm-hmm.
Jackson and Jumper, these are co-founders of Stirp. And Dr. Lavoie, I've been in touch with him recently, and he has a theory about when the image was formed, and we can talk about that later. He's another great researcher. But go back. I'm sorry to interrupt. I apologize for interrupting
So,
the flow, but to see you're in a monastery, you've gotten slides, you're doing research, you got materials now, 1980-ish or 1986, I think you said. And so then what happens from there?
well, I had a really interesting experience when I got back from the conference because the the conference there were five people that thought the shroud was probably authentic and two skeptics that thought it was a fake, but they just actually disagreed with one another. And one of those was Dr. Walter McCrone, who Stirp had actually used as a consultant to look at some sticky tapes, and that's a whole story in itself. We won't get into that here, but um, McCrone said that he had been saying since 1980 that he thought the shroud was a painting, which is ridiculous because there's no paint on the shroud other than a few uh, flecks that might have come off. Like 52 different people were allowed to paint the shroud or a replica of the shroud
Yeah,
in its presence and then touch their copy to the real shroud. And so paint flecks might, come off and
yeah,
you might, but it's not, it doesn't make up the image.
right.
Um, but anyway, McCrone was saying that he thought that it literally was painted on there, which everybody else on Stirp disagreed with him.
Right.
And when the small town Pennsylvania, the conference was in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania, at a college up there. And when the AP story came out, it was the local AP writer, and the headline for the article was about McCrone, and they made it look like this was the latest news when in fact it was 6 years old at the time.
Yeah.
So I was very upset that when five people thought it was authentic and two didn't, and the two who thought it was a fake disagreed. I didn't think that was a fair headline for the AP writer to come up with, and the St. Louis paper picked it up, and this was like on I guess probably a Tuesday that week. So it came out a couple days after the weekend. And I had duties at the school. We ran a boys' school at the monastery. So all day long, I'm thinking, um, man, I want to write a letter to the editor and set them straight. So finally, about 4 o'clock, my school day ends, and I'm literally rushing to the monastery to write this letter to the editor. And just one more piece of background for this. One of the jobs that I did just on my own was to pick up trash on the monastery grounds. We had 150 acres. As you can imagine, it could accumulate quite a bit of trash every week. So I would go around every week and pick up all the garbage that people left around. So I'm literally rushing uh, to my room to write this letter, and I had this uh, inner voice, and it was the first time I had an experience like this. And I later found out it's called a locution, where you get sort of an inner communication that you know is not yourself, and you just, if it happens to you, you'll know what I'm talking about. But if you haven't had it, it's kind of hard to explain. But I had this inner communication where I heard, it wasn't an audible voice, but it was a strong, insistent inner voice saying, "Go pick up trash." So I thought, this is not me talking to myself.
Yeah.
I just really felt like this was a divine sort of communication. And I thought, I better do this.
Yeah.
So I spent the next hour picking up trash, even though I was dying to get inside to write my letter. And finally, I'm getting toward the end, and I'm in a parking lot near the monastery, and I hear a car door, and I look behind me, and it was the regional vice president of the big CBS affiliate in St. Louis called KMOX Radio, which, even though it was in the middle of the United States, the signal was so strong that sometimes in Canada you could pick up the signal.
Mm.
Um, so I said, the guy was a parishioner there, and I said, "Hello, Mr. Highland. Did you see the article about the shroud in the paper this morning?" And he said, "No, I heard about it, but I haven't read it." And I went on to explain to him how inaccurate it was. And he says, "Well," he says, "we can put you on the radio about it." And he says, and he gives me a guy's name to call. Um, and they were producing a program called the World of Religion at that time, which they would record in St. Louis, and then it would be picked up all over the country by other CBS stations.
Oh, okay.
So I called the guy he told me to, and he said, he says, "Oh," he says, we were planning on interviewing Walter McCrone, Dr. Walter McCrone. How would you like to come on with him?" And I had never been done TV or radio at that point, so I was kind of green in that area, and I said, "Look, I don't agree with the guy, but um, all I'm trying to do is right the wrong about the newspaper article." He says, "Well, come on, let's do the debate with him." So I went down the next Sunday, and we recorded. They had Macron on the phone from Chicago, and we recorded a little mini debate. And I must have done okay, because the um, moderator said that he was not impressed by Macron's arguments.
Mm.
So at least I held my own. So, but that was always kind of a sign to me that um, God was involved with this. I mean, he
So had you
organized.
not picked up the trash in that certain way
Yes,
and taken
right.
that time and gotten to the parking lot, this
I
encounter would
don't. I
never
don't
have
end up on
happened,
the radio.
and you would
Yeah,
never end up.
exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing that these things are like this.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great
Um,
story. But we so you're so let me go back to the image for 1 second so people understand the image. The image on the shroud depicts a naked, am I correct? Naked,
yes.
crucified man
Yes.
about 5'10", 5'11", whatever, 170, 180 pounds maybe, from
Yep.
what I can tell, who has been, he's crucified. He has nails through his wrist bones,
Hmm.
his feet as the ankle, I guess, a part of it.
Hmm.
He has a crown of thorns. He has a lance wound on the side, out of which is serous fluid, not just blood, this, serous fluid. And everything in every detail that corresponds to what we've been told through the Gospels about the passion
Yes.
of Jesus in every single
Yes.
detail. So that it's, I mean, there's no argument about what it depicts. There can be no
No.
argument about the figure. The figure is scourged as well, correct? With the
Yes.
Roman flagrum, which had two or three of those barbell ends, whatever metal ends.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, every time I look at the shroud, I think of the extraordinary beating, and the figure's face is punched, I think, and bruised. The extraordinary suffering and beating that this
Yeah.
person took. And just also by way of explanation, the crown of thorns in many pictures in art history is depicted like a kind of a little wreath, a little nice
Right.
curlicue. In fact, it was probably a helmet of
Yeah.
very big, jagged thorns that came
Yeah.
from the Jerusalem area. Uh, so in every detail, we have the only person we know has been crucified like this in history is Jesus.
Absolutely.
Right? I mean, we
So,
have a lot of records about the Romans crucified a lot of people. It was a horrible, horrible
mm,
punishment. Tom Holland has a great description of crucifixion in his book Dominion. It came out recently. I mean, an awful thing because there you were
mm,
completely immobilized. You were a prey to anybody who could punch you, hit you. You're dying. You can't breathe. You got to push on your legs to be able to
yeah.
breathe.
Right.
So, in every detail, this corresponds to the figure that is described in the Gospels. So, that has to be clear to people. Okay? The second fact is
Yeah.
that people sent to investigate this image, scientists concluded that they could not explain how the image was created.
Yep.
So now we come. So I followed this. I remember as a kid, I think I'm about, oh, I think you're a few months older than I am, Joe. I was born
Mm,
October 54. So I followed this from afar. I remember hearing about the shroud and all. And then all of a sudden I hear something, oh, the shroud's a fake. They did carbon dating, and there you go. It's a fake. And that was 1988, I believe, when the carbon dating results came out. Am I correct in that?
the results were announced in October 13th, 1988, and the official report came out in February of 1989.
Okay. So all right. So then I figure, okay, well, I guess, and a person who's not interested in this is going to say, oh, I guess it's a fake, it's a forgery, let's move
Yeah.
on, whatever, another fraudulent thing. However, I also know now going through my own research that the scientific protocol that was recommended for carbon dating was never really followed. There were major,
Right.
major, and this is what gets me as a man of, as a doctor, as a man of science, as it were. What bothers me to no end is how people abandon fundamental principles and then
Yeah.
purport to produce results that did not adhere to those principles. I mean, it's shameful. It's a disgrace to
Hmm.
science. And they've even hidden the raw data of the carbon dating that was imperfectly done and improperly done, uh, and had to be released by Freedom of Information Act through the British Museum,
Correct.
right? But let me get back. So the carbon dating results come out. What's your response? What do you think? How did you feel about it?
Well, by that time, I had been studying the shroud about 11 years. And um, so when the C14 results came out, my initial reaction is there's something wrong with this dating. It just does not match with all the other data that Stirp accumulated, which was all, pointing toward it being an authentic Middle Eastern burial cloth from about the first century.
Right.
So I knew that there had to be some explanation. And so, I mean, by that time I was collecting anything I could get my hands on anyway. So I just continued to do that, and um, you know, got any new books and articles that came out on the C14 and otherwise. And then eventually, in 2016, I think it was, I wrote a 3-part, 175-page article about the politics of the testing. When you dig deep into it, it was like this was not just pure unadulterated science. There was just egos and agendas and backstabbings and Machiavellian maneuvers by people. And I thought, there's that had to affect what happened and
And
affect the
financial
dates.
interests. There were financial interests, I understand too. These labs kind
Sure.
of jostling to get purchase in that
Yeah.
world of that kind of technology.
Yeah. I firmly believe that even if they had acknowledged they were supposed to do chemical testing on the shroud samples and they didn't, and supposedly they said, well, we knew it was the shroud. Well, that doesn't make any difference. You should do chemical testing, because especially since there was only one sample, and that with the one sample only, that was probably the biggest mistake of the whole thing, that they only use one sample, because you don't know if it's representative of the whole cloth. The shroud had been repaired numerous times. So if you take one sample and don't have anything to compare it with on the rest of the cloth, you don't know if you got a repaired sample or not, or a part of the real cloth.
And so, Joe, where did the
Um,
sample come from? Tell us, where did it come from? From the middle of the
all
shroud?
right.
From the where did the
It
sample
came
come
from
from?
the outside corner of the frontal image
Okay,
on the very edge.
okay. And you're talking about a
Um,
very small strip.
about one centimeter by 7 centimeter strip.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. And then that was divided up into multiple samples. The labs got Oxford got one sample, Zurich got one sample. Arizona, their first sample was smaller than what Oxford and Zurich had gotten, so they snipped off one little extra piece to make the weights about the same between. So Arizona had two samples, Oxford and Zurich only had one, and then Turin kept an extra sample, which will come into importance in another aspect that I'll bring up later. Um, but it's only, it was that was the first and probably the biggest fatal flaw, that they only took the one sample. They were supposed to originally they had thought about taking 7 labs and samples from 3 different areas. And it turned out they only took 3 labs and one sample, and they were also going to use the method they used was called AMS, accelerated mass spectrometry, and that method was only about 11 years old at the time, because it was invented like in 77,
Yeah.
and it wasn't that much proven on cloth that much. Um, the old method was called proportional counter, but the problem with that is that it needed a much larger piece of material to do the counting that gives them the results. And they still talked about doing a proportional counting, but at the end, they only used the AMS method. So
And Joe,
big problems from the very beginning.
did the labs know who had which sample? Did they ever communicate with each other? Because I understand that they were supposed to have been blinded, as it were, and independent.
Yeah, they admitted that they knew they were given control samples, but get this, the, the idea of control samples, meaning other clause of known dates. So you give the labs a control sample that you know the date of. You have them test that to see if they're accurate with the control sample.
Yeah.
Well, they actually, the control samples that they gave to the 3 labs, they told them the dates when they gave them the control samples, which
No.
is unheard of. You don't do that in a scientific experiment, because that opens it up to a bias and manipulation. You shouldn't. They're supposed to be blind to the. They're not supposed
Yeah.
to know what the dates of the control samples were, but they already knew that. And then they could tell the shroud was so unique in its 3-to-1 herringbone pattern
Mhm.
that they could tell that the samples they had gotten were the shroud.
All right. So you have a number of scientific principles that have been flouted to begin with, in which these labs then base their findings. And so what did they conclude in 1989 when they made their official proclamation?
They said that with 95% certainty, um, the shroud dated to between 1260 and 1390.
Okay.
So that's obviously too late um, to have wrapped Jesus, who was believed to have died in either 30 or 33 AD, first century.
Yeah.
Um, but as I said, most people thought there's just something wrong with this. It just doesn't match. Carbon 14 um, isn't a be all and end all. I mean, it can be through archaeologists routinely throw out uh, carbon 14 dates if they've got other data to match it with. It's a confirmatory test. It's not a litmus test for that discounts all the other testing. And then the shroud had tons of had the best science and technology at the time by Stirp in 1978, and none of that suggested anything medieval about it.
And so that's an important point. So let me stop there. So even if this were legitimate testing, you have to be aware of the limitations of the testing method itself. It's not as if anything's infallible. So let's say
Yeah.
you had legitimate testing, carbon dated it to medieval times, and you had 50 other parameters that are dating it or getting it corresponding to a particular another time. You still have to take those things into account.
Yeah.
But they took a slice of this cloth from the corner, which is probably where people use their hands. They held it up and did all kinds of things,
Exactly.
right?
Yep.
There were sequential differences in the area that was dated and that little piece of cloth anyway.
Yeah.
But you wrote these. You were the one who really wrote the seminal paper that really cast doubt and it really exposed the fraudulence
Mm.
of that carbon dating. And you showed
Yes.
you showed very tell us about that because you showed some very important things, right? About the
Hmm.
material. This is a linen cloth. Linen was very expensive in those days. And according to Gospel, Joseph Arimathea, who was one of the Sanhedrin, had this linen cloth for his own use, apparently, or procured it somehow, was very expensive, and had a 3-to-1 herringbone pattern. Uh, this was corroborated by other knowledge about other materials at the time that were being used. So you come in, you write this monograph. Tell us about that monograph. Tell us about what
Hmm.
you discovered and promulgated.
Yeah. So my late wife Sue also believed that something was wrong with the C14 dating. And she looked at, we started looking at really good pictures, close-ups of the C14 area, and she thought she noticed some anomalies there. And uh, I had a great collection of materials even back then of all the known shroud material at the time. And I started collecting or pulling out anything to do with textiles and any references to repairs. And we found there was a commission in 1969 and 1973 that had done some minor testing on the shroud. And one quote really caught my eye by a guy named Enzo De Lorenzi. And he said that he thought that the shroud had undergone many documented and undocumented repairs.
Hmm.
So I thought, aha, I think this is starting to lead this. It led to the idea that they probably possibly dated a repaired sample. So we ended up writing a paper uh, called "Evidence for the Skewing of the let's see, of the C14 dating of the Shroud of Turin," something like that. And we presented at a conference in Orvieto, Italy, in August of 2000. And it was very well received. Barry Schwartz was in the audience, and he was sitting in the front row, and he came up to us right away and afterwards and said, "Oh, I'd really like to put this on Shroud.com." So we said, "Sure." So we sent him the paper, and he put it on Shroud.com. And he was commenting. He says, "Boy, this is a great explanation because you don't have to be a nuclear physicist to understand it."
Right.
Because and it's simple. It's like the shroud's an old cloth. They did repairs. They only took one sample. That area, it was already taken from a area that had been cut out already for relics. And if you don't
Oh,
repair, once it's frayed, if you don't repair it, it's going to fray even more.
right.
So it's
Oh,
very likely
interesting.
that they repaired it. So he put it up on Shroud.com, and Ray Rogers was the lead chemist for the STURP team, and he had pretty much accepted the C14 date. So he had been out of the Shroud's picture for quite some time, but it recently come back because um, a friend of mine from St. Louis wrote a Shroud book, pro Shroud book, and Ray caught wind of it and had some complaints about it and stuff, and so that kind of partially brought him back in. And then when Barry published Sue and I, the paper by Sue and me on the site, it really kind of ruffled his feathers, and he called Barry up. He said, "What are you doing publishing this sort of junk?" And I can't use the real word that he used, but um, and Barry said, "Well, right, they followed the scientific method. We had sent pictures previously before the paper. We had sent pictures, close-ups of the C14 area to three independent textile experts. Did not tell them it was the shroud, and we said, "What can you tell us about what you see here?" And basically, all three of them independently said that they thought that there had been a repair there. So we started to think we were getting to be on solid ground there. Um, so Ray Rogers still had some samples from the main part of the shroud in 1978. He was not. I'm not giving a secret away there. He was allowed to keep those. All the researchers from 1978 were allowed to keep samples and any of their own work. They were told up front that they could do that. So Ray had some samples left from the main part of the shroud from 1978. And he was also given, in 1979, he was given some samples from what's called the Reyes sample, which was taken right next to the C14 sample in 1988. And so in that commission that I mentioned in 1969 to 73, Dr. Gilbert Reyes, Raes, was given a small strip of the shroud there for textile analysis. And it was called the Reyes sample.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Rogers was given a part of that Reyes sample in 1979. And as I say, that was literally right next to the C14 sample that was taken in 1988. Okay. So Ray says to Barry, "Well, I've got samples from the main part of the shroud, and I've got the Reyes samples." And he just assumed, but actually later confirmed, that what was found on the Reyes sample would be found on the C14 sample. He says, "I've got samples from both. I'll prove these people wrong in 5 minutes." And Barry said, "Well, Ray, go for it."
Mm-hmm.
So about an hour and a half later, Ray called Barry back, and he was a lot more calm. And he says, "I can't believe it. I think they're right." He
Really?
compared the two. He compared the two and actually found cotton in the C14 in the Reyes sample, and the shroud is just linen, so there
Right,
shouldn't be cotton there
right.
unless it happened to be repaired. And cotton is easier to dye than linen, and so there's a technique called invisible reweaving that the French perfected in the 1500s. And if you look at, it's interesting if you look at a color picture of the C14 area, it's like a dark green.
Yeah,
And if you look at the main part of the shroud, it's sort of like a orangey type, orange reddish type
yeah,
of color.
yeah.
So in chemists, different colors indicate different uh, chemical structures. So the fact that the C14 area was dark green and the main part was orange says that there seem to be different cloths here.
Right,
And so Ray ended up doing research for several years. And then in 2005, he wrote an article in a very high end chemistry journal called Thermochemica Acta,
right.
and he stated in there that the what he found. That paper is available online on shroud.com. You can read the whole paper there. But he concluded that based on cotton and he found dye and different things, all the characteristics you would expect if there had been a repair there. Um, he said that the C14 sample. Oh, and by the way, I had mentioned earlier on that Turin had originally kept an extra sample of the C14 in 1988. Well, they had given Ray some threads from the middle of the sample that they kept in 2003. So he had suspected that the C14 sample would be the same as the Reyes sample, and he confirmed that.
Right. Gotcha.
So, so that whole area there had been repaired. So he concluded in his article that the sample was not representative of the whole cloth, and thus the C14 um, results were not valid for determining the age of the cloth.
Okay. And unfortunately, that news didn't have quite the impact that the
No,
news in 1989 did from the C14
right.
dating. Although now recently, I understand there's a new method has been used that has come to our attention that supports an earlier dating of the shroud to the first century. I forget exactly. It's some kind
It's
of a
wide.
spectrographic.
It's wide angle X-ray scattering.
Yes, wide angle.
Like,
That's right. Yes.
yeah.
Okay. And that seems to point to a first century cloth. Am I correct in assuming that?
Yes, with a caveat. So um, the assumption, those results are dependent on assuming that the shroud existed under a certain humidity and temperature for several centuries, and we don't know that for sure.
Right. Okay.
But it does seem to match to a cloth from Masada in terms of the degradation of the cellulose.
Okay.
Um,
Got it.
so I think that that test and possibly even some of the other dating tests probably need a little more vetting before we accept them
Okay.
as a consensus among scientists. But there's some really hopeful tests out there that are all pointing toward the first century.
Yeah, and I'm glad you say that too. We have to look at what the actual evidence tells us about these things. And there are caveats with all these kinds of testing methods, and you can't
Yeah.
just leap on one and say, there we go, there's the
Mm.
answer.
Yeah.
But the other thing is the shroud itself has had, in a way, it's a miracle that the shroud has survived, if it indeed dates from the first century. We think it was held was it Edessa for quite some time? And that the king of Constantinople went there and demanded it under duress. You probably know more about it.
Mhm.
I can't quite give you a fluid history where the
Mhm.
shroud went, except that there are traces of it being possibly in Edessa, then Constantinople, then the Crusaders stole it, brought it to France, and then from France it ended up in Turin, something along those lines.
Yeah. The history is sketchy. We have to be honest about that. The Odessa theory is one of the more prominent ones. It's not the only one out there, but Ian Wilson was a proponent of the shroud existing um, back in the early centuries under the name of the image of Odessa. So
Yes.
it's believed in that theory that the shroud was hidden, or the image of Edessa was hidden in the city walls, and then there was a flood, a massive flood in Edessa in like 525, and then it's interesting though after they refound it. It's interesting if you look at art history at that point, all the depictions of Jesus start looking like the typical depiction of Christ that we're familiar with, and which were probably all based on the shroud.
Yeah, and I'm glad you
So,
mentioned that because I'm thinking, the earlier depictions of Christ in Roman times, he was beardless. He
yeah,
looked like a Roman like nymph, kind of a whatever you want to call it, like a little. It was a very different kind of depiction
yes,
of Jesus. And then, at the same time, you get the Pantocrator, you get the iconic images that match the face of the shroud. I mean, it's
yeah,
phenomenal that shift in art history that occurred. And then the shroud also survived at least one fire, maybe two fires, if I'm not mistaken. Silver burned through the corners. That's why we
hmm,
see these patched areas, etc. So it's been an amazing trajectory for this cloth to have made it this far and then to have been revealed in the way it's been revealed.
yeah. I believe God has had a hand in preserving it through all the lootings, the fires, and
Yeah.
everything, the floods. If it was in the city walls, that it was rediscovered. Um, so it was known as the image of Edessa, and then it was eventually taken to Constantinople in 944 AD. And it's interesting the description by the sons of the emperors of the emperor there. They said that it looked like a moist secretion without artificial coloring or stain, which,
Mhm.
if you think about it, is a pretty good description of how the shroud looks to the naked eye.
Yeah.
Um, and then it was in Constantinople at least until 1204, when a French knight said that it was in a church and it was raised up. He said every Friday the image was raised up so that you could see the figure of our Lord. And then some people think it was stolen out of Constantinople. Some think it remained there a few years, but eventually it made its way to a little town called Lirey, France. That's Lirey.
Yes.
Uh, and a knight named by the name of Geoffrey de Charnay ended up with the cloth, and it's unclear how he got it, but he was related to he was related to someone who was involved with the sack of Constantinople in 1204 if it was stolen. So he might have gotten it passed down from his uh, descendant. Um, so then, oh, and by the way, once the cloth image of Edessa got to Constantinople, it became known as the Mandylion, Mandylion.
Right.
So image of Edessa, Mandylion, and then it shows up in Lirey in 1357. For a while, it was called the Shroud of Lirey, and then eventually it uh, because Cardinal Borromeo, Charles Borromeo, wanted to make a pilgrimage to France from Italy to see the shroud. the owners of the shroud brought it over to Turin because the House of Savoy had ruled parts of France and part of Italy, and they brought it over to Turin, and it's been there ever since 1578. And the only time it was out of Turin was during a few years during World War II because Hitler was interested in it. So they moved it to, they secreted it away to a Benedictine monastery near Rome. And only the abbot and a few of the monks knew it was there. And Hitler wanted to get his hands on it because he was interested in the occult and thought
Right.
if he had the shroud, he would have some power, extra power with it. And apparently, the some of the soldiers went into this church, this monastery church, and were, I think it was kept underneath the altar or something, hidden away. Um, and the monks were praying, and somehow I think it was by God twisting the German person's the officer's arm from above, and because he says, well, let's not disturb the monks praying, and
Hmm.
they left. They were very close to it, but didn't find it.
Really
So
incredible.
yeah,
That's incredible. So the shroud has survived. And Joe, when was that big fire where the silver, uh,
yeah.
which was held, burned through it?
So the fire was in Chambéry, France, and it was called the Shroud of Chambéry for a while too,
Yeah.
1532,
Okay.
and it was almost destroyed. It was in a silver casket, and some molten silver um, melted and dropped on, and the cloth was folded
Right.
like an eighth or whatever. So when the molten silver went all the way through, when you unfolded the cloth, um, those burns reproduced itself in the folding pattern by which it was folded.
Right.
When you unfolded it. Fortunately, the only part of the image that was obscured or damaged was the shoulders, but the main part of the image, front and back, was saved. And again, I think that's the hand of God in that.
And the shroud and on the shroud itself, they look like sort of diamond shaped kinds of artifacts
Right.
that have been
Those are patches that the nuns
patched.
sewed in 1534.
Right.
And then, so the shroud at the time was owned by the House of Savoy, and there was a woman named Margaret of Austria who owned the shroud, and she she died in 1508, I think, and she had put in her will that she wanted part of the shroud to go to a certain church. Anyway, Sue and I thought that the invisible reweaving was probably done around 1530.
Yeah.
She died in her will was in 150. I'm sorry, her will was in 1508. She died around 1531. So we think the invisible reweaving happened right around the time or shortly before she died, because she had access to the best weavers in the land, and if the shroud was needed repair, her weavers were the people to do it.
Right. Let me make a little aside too. I understand there's been pollen evidence that's been examined that indicates that the pollen samples actually match the trajectory of
Mm.
Jerusalem up through areas like Odessa and France and whatnot. Is that correct?
For the most part, the person that did those studies, Dr. Max Fry,
Yeah.
died in 1983 before he could publish his full work. And some of his work has been called into question by not only skeptics but people on the pro shroud side. Other people have tried to follow up, and some people have backtracked a little bit. The pollen's kind of murky. Um, that's one area where I wish the some good research could be done. But when the Turin authorities in 2002 did a quote, I'll put restoration on the shroud, they destroyed some some good scientific evidence, and I think the pollen was one of those aspects that kind of got messed up a little bit. But for the most part, the pollen evidence does seem to suggest, that it was in Jerusalem, and then there's also pollen found from Turkey and Italy and France.
Right. Now, have you seen David Rolfe's latest film? David Rolfe, I think his first
Yeah,
film was done, what, in the 90s, called Silent Witness. Is that
that
the
came out in '78, right around
78?
this. Yeah,
Oh,
it came
okay,
out that
that
early.
early.
Yeah,
That was his
yeah.
first film about the Shroud, and then just a few years ago, a year or two ago, maybe, he released a new film whose name escaped me. I apologize. It
Who
could be
can the latest one's called "Who Can He Be"?
Who Can He Be? Right. Yeah. I've
Yeah.
seen, I have a copy of it. He sent me a copy of it. It's a brilliant film. He
Hmm.
does a tremendous, beautiful explication of the Shroud history. What were your thoughts about that film? Did you like it?
I liked all of his films. He he is very um, dynamic in how he presents his films, and they're all very good. I think he has a package where you can get like three of his films on DVD. Highly recommend that. And there's one that was available on the BSTS newsletter site. It was in between the Silent Witness and Who Can He Be? I can't think of the name of it, but that was mainly on the C14.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's still available free. I know you could probably rent it, but if you go to bstsnewsletter.com, you should be able to find information on that.
Yeah. Well, I've seen Silent Witness and Who Can He Be? I think they're both superb. I mean,
Yes.
really, really beautifully done. He's a very engaging filmmaker. Again, he was, he didn't have any skin in the game, as it were, when he
Hmm.
first tackled that project back in the 70s. Uh,
Right. In fact, I think he intended to try to debunk it at
yeah,
first, and then
yeah,
ended up thinking it was authentic, and it
yeah.
it really transformed his life, much as it transformed mine and many others along the way.
So let me get to really, I think, particularly pivotal question, which is does the validity of Christianity depend upon the authenticity of the shroud, in your view?
I think that's a firm no. Um, but on the other hand, if it's authentic, it just adds so much. And for me, I think it concretizes my faith. Um, in the Gospels, it said, I think in the book of Acts, it said Jesus performed many other acts, not listed here. And and in Gospel of John, the last line, he says, these are not the only things that Jesus did. If I wrote everything that he did, all the books in the world couldn't cover it.
Yeah.
So you can't. One of the big complaints or objections by skeptics is saying, oh, if there had been an image on the shroud, they would have mentioned it. Well, not necessarily. Um, for one thing, uh, a, a bloody Jewish burial cloth was an unclean object,
Hmm.
and you wouldn't run out of the tomb saying, "Look what we got,"
Oh,
because both
yeah,
the Romans and the Jews would have, killed you and destroyed the cloth. So
exactly.
there's something, historians note that there's something called, in the early church, called the discipline of the secret, which means that there was certain, like a coded language that Christians used, that they could communicate with one another, but without revealing too much to the Romans and the Jews. For example, in the book of Revelation, when when the word Babylon is used, that's a code word for Rome.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
if you lived in the Roman Empire and you wanted to criticize Rome, you don't use the word Rome.
Right.
You use a different word. So I don't think it's that surprising that the image on the shroud was not mentioned, because they would have tried to keep it secret.
And is there not a passage, is it in John, at the end of John, where they look, I think John runs in before Peter, uh,
Hmm.
correct? And then
Yes.
Peter comes in, and there's a phrase, I forget exactly what, but there's something about they saw and they were convinced.
John said he saw and he believed.
He saw and he believed. Yes.
And he believed. Now,
And
yeah, people need to think about that because, at that point, Jesus had not appeared to any of the apostles. Okay.
right,
And when he did, Matthew it says some saw, some doubted, you know. So, but the fact that John actually, based on what he saw, and a lot of people's suspicion is that he saw the shroud lying there like he saw it on Friday afternoon, but just the burial cloths with no body in it. Now, if somebody had stolen the cloth, or the body rather, you wouldn't uh, leave the cloth behind and take the body naked. You'd take the whole thing, the body
you'd,
and the
you'd,
cloth,
you'd
right?
bundle it up somehow. You'd bundle it
Yeah,
up and spirit
yeah.
it out if you were
You would
doing
just
that.
pick up the body in the cloth and take out. You wouldn't bother to unwrap it if you're stealing a body.
Yeah,
So it's probably he saw the shroud lying there, but no body in it. And it says he saw and he believed, and that was before he had an appearance of the risen Lord.
right.
So what does that tell you? The shroud, in his case, caused belief. Now, if he had saw and believed and didn't get any other appearances of Jesus later, well, you could question that then. But he saw Jesus later, but the fact of the matter is, he saw the linen cloths lying there, and that alone was enough to make him believe. So I think the shroud can be a trigger of faith for many people.
Yeah.
Now, it's never been it's not a matter of dogma or doctrine or anything like that. That the church does not do that with any relic. They do not say, okay, this relic is true, you must believe in it. The most they do is say that, okay, you can venerate this relic, and they let you do that as long as there's not firm evidence that it is a fake. Okay. So the fact that there were exhibitions of the shroud after the C14 says that they don't believe the results of the 1988 dating, because they wouldn't exhibit it if they thought it was a fake.
That's
Okay.
a very important point, Joe. I think
So
that's a great point. The other thing is that do you think that John do you think John saw an image on the shroud? I mean,
that's a good
there's
question. Some people think that it took um, decades for the image to form. Some people think it was right away. Um, I don't have a firm opinion one way or the other. Um, One of the most interesting experiments was done by an Italian group. The acronym is ENEA. I forget what that stands for, but there's a physicist named Paolo Di Lazzaro who,
oh yeah,
between about 2010 and 2015, did some experiments. And what they did was they shot an ultraviolet, a short burst of radiation from a excimer ultraviolet laser, I think it's called, on a control sample, and they tried different lengths and stuff. And if you don't do it long enough, you don't get anything. If you do it too long, you burn a hole through the linen. And
right.
what they found was if you made the burst like 150 billionth of a second,
150
uh,
billionth of a second.
150 billionth of a second. So I mean, we can't even wrap our heads around that. For
Right.
that, that's
Yeah.
that's fast. Okay. um, but at that time frame, they were able to duplicate this in just one little spot. I'm not talking about the whole cloth,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
but one little spot they were able to duplicate the superficiality and the color, which suggests that it's kind of like a laser type um, mechanism of some kind. Now, the fact that this is probably a good point to bring in if people are wondering if if the body was enfolded and maybe even wrapped around the head tightly and stuff like that, why is the image, if you put coloring on your face and put a cloth and then fold out the cloth, your face is going to expand, right?
Yeah.
So the shroud image cannot be contact, at least in partly for the face and stuff like that. I mean, the contact, the blood marks can be from contact, but not the image formation.
Right.
Um, so one scientist believes that it was like there was a vertical collimation of radiation, like a million. I forget what number he used, but like uh, a laser coming from every pore of the body and going vertically collimated to zap the image front and back. I mean,
Like
it sounds
energy,
like science
energy, and
fiction,
like energy just sort of expanding like this, just completely
but
separate.
completely up and completely
Yeah,
down
completely.
to get the
Yeah,
full uh, proportionally correct dimensions of the body.
yeah.
Um, it sounds like science fiction, but when when you exhaust, sort of like Sherlock Holmes saying, when you eliminate all the possibilities, whatever's left is the answer.
That's
Well,
right.
if there's no natural explanation, you have to be open to the possibility of a supernatural explanation. Now, in fairness to the skeptics, you could always say, well, just because we don't know how it was done doesn't mean that we won't know in the future. Yeah, but
Okay.
that's going to be unlikely. If they haven't
Well,
found out by now, they probably never will.
well, I would say that I mean the idea that it was the work of a an artistic forger seems to be completely debunked.
Yeah.
There's no directionality. There are no
No.
paintbrush marks. There's nothing. Such a unique image.
Mm-hmm.
The image itself is again the negative image of it, the VP8 analysis that came from it. Everything about this is so unique, and the correspondence in minute detail of
Yeah.
everything we've been told about the crucifixion
Mm-hmm.
of Jesus of Nazareth. You don't have to be, Barry Schwartz wasn't a Christian. He didn't die a Christian.
Great.
He became a more, I think, a practicing Jew at some point, but uh, it corresponds to the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth in a way that is, I think, incontrovertible. The level of detail, the precision of detail, everything. It's just phenomenal. So I'm disappointed that the scientific approach taken by the
Mm-hmm.
C14 labs really abandoned their scientific principles when they went to do the analysis. They went for the PR. They got a lot of notoriety. They accomplished what they wanted to accomplish, which is probably financial and
Mm-hmm.
fame and whatnot. When they should have done their work as scientists, as the original team did. They worked as true
Mm-hmm.
scientists. And as you yourself have demonstrated today, you've got to look at all the evidence. You've got to question
Mm-hmm.
things. You can't take anything and run
Yeah.
to it and hold it up as a flag. So that to me is extremely important. Um, I'd like to ask, do you have any particularly favorite books that you recommend to people about the Shroud and any other
Mm-hmm.
favorite films or videos or whatever? Just so
Mm-hmm.
listeners can kind of go to these
Yeah.
things.
Yeah, you mentioned Russ Braille's book.
Yeah.
I was looking at that again last night. I highly recommend that one.
Yeah, and
Uh,
I'll bring this up. You
yeah,
can't see it the right way, but anyway, it's
yeah, no, that's right.
book
Yeah.
Shroud Encounter,
Hmm.
right?
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Um, let's see. Um, this another book that's slightly older but was very good is called uh, it's either Test the Shroud or Testing the Shroud by Mark Antonacci. That came out in I think 2020 or somewhere around there.
Okay.
Maybe a little earlier than that. That's all
Okay.
these books you should be able to find on Amazon.
Yeah.
Um, Dr. Lavoie's recent book is very good.
I
Uh,
just ordered that, in fact, and I've been in correspondence with him because
mhm,
his theory is that the image, if we can digress for a minute, the image was formed in the act of resurrection, given
Hmm.
um, given the positioning of the body itself. I haven't read the book yet, but I've had a little bit of a correspondence with him, and I've heard about his ideas, which seem very interesting, as opposed to
Yeah,
an image occurring when the body was prone on flat on
laying flat.
a
Yeah,
slab. So that's something to look into, and I'm hoping to talk with him further about that.
yeah. Um, if
What's
you
the
do a
title of that, Joe? What's the
that
title of that book?
something like the Shroud of Turin and the sign that John ingeniously concealed, or something like that.
Okay, all right, okay,
If you
yeah.
do a search on his name, Lavoie, Lavoie, and Shroud, it should come up. Um, oh gosh, there's so many books out there. Ian Wilson actually is supposed to come out with a new book soon, but
Oh,
that
really?
that is not out yet. But I look forward to that
That
because
would be great.
he's one of the best writers out there.
Yeah.
Um, gosh, and there's so many videos. I might tell your listeners and you if I have a weekly list of recent information, news, books, videos on the shroud, and there's some really good videos out there. Some not so good. I tend to put a lot of them out there and let people make up their own mind whether it's good or not. But if people want to get that, if they send me an email at jmarino240 at AOL.com, I send them out once a week. Um, and if any new films come out, there's an excellent um, one that came out on a documentary on Trinity Broadcasting Network, TBN,
Yeah.
and you can see it if you download their mobile app um, and do a search on Shroud of Turin. That one comes up. That one is excellent.
Oh, is it
It's
really?
about
Okay.
55 minutes long. Yeah.
So
I think
TBN,
I
Trinity Broadcast Network.
Broadcasting Network. Yeah. Go to their mobile app,
Yep.
do a search on Shroud, and then if you scroll down a little bit and look for, there'll be a description of it, the Shroud of Turin, and I think it'll say 50 or 55 minutes documentary. It is really well done. They're going to come out. They're coming out with maybe a 6-part series, uh, and they're doing a full movie that's supposed to be out on Easter 2026,
Really?
plus six like 1 hour segments. They've got so much stuff. Um,
Well,
that's really well done.
that's great to hear. And
Um,
of course, David Rolf's film that Who Can He Be? I think I want to recommend that.
that's a good one.
That's a great one, I think.
I might also mention I don't know why they're doing this, but I've just seen publicity recently for a film called The Face of Jesus that's going to be out in the theaters in the United States uh, only on June 3rd, which seems kind of silly to me. Why put out a film for just one day?
Really?
I suppose if it does gangbusters at the box office, they might extend it. But for any of your listeners in the United States, you might want to keep an eye out for that. Um, the
Is it
Face of
about the Shroud?
Jesus.
Is that about the Shroud?
They do the shroud, the face of Montepello, the veil of Montepello.
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask you
Uh,
about that one too. I just learned about that. I know about the Sudarium of Oviedo, but I just learned
mhm.
about the Holy Face of Montepello, which is in Abruzzo in Italy.
Yeah,
Another fascinating image. I would so that
I
should be a good thing to see then, I think.
yeah yeah. I personally question the veil of Montepello, even though I think Padre Pio and Pope Benedict XVI were actually both devotees of it. But the image to me on it looks artistic.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there's it apparently has some very strange characteristics to it as well. So um, I don't know.
Okay.
They're gonna. I'm sure we'll learn more in the film when they talk about it, and I hope they extend it beyond one day because that's just too short of a
One
period
day
for.
is ridiculous. But we
Uh,
still, no matter what, we have www.shroud.com as probably the gold mine of all Shroud websites and all information about the Shroud, which
Yeah,
you are commandeering with your board members, which Barry founded,
yeah.
and which is a beautiful resource for anybody interested
Mm,
in that. So I would recommend they go there. Also, I wanted to put a plug in. There's a website, shroudphotos.com, which has
mm,
Vernon Miller's images, which are some of which
yeah.
are spectacular. I found a Jet Propulsion Lab image that was just absolutely beautiful
Mm,
in color, um, of the face and other things. So readers, I mean, listeners have a wide range of things to look at. And Joe, I really think it's been a great pleasure to talk to you, and I really admire the work you've done and your devotion to
mm,
your work, and I admire your unflinchingly truly scientific attitude about evidence pro and con. I mean, that's the mark of
mm,
an objective researcher here and all these things.
mm.
So,
Can I mention a couple other things before we
yeah,
go?
sure, of course, we have
Um,
plans. Yeah,
another another excellent website is by a French researcher named Thierry Castex. He has done some marvelous 3D renditions of the shroud. He uses software that's used for, I think, earthquakes or something. But these are some,
yeah.
I mean, most of the 3D images, the spatial encoding renditions I've seen are pretty impressive, but these are just in a level by itself. So it's www.thierrycastex
Erie
dot
Costex. Yeah, yeah. Okay.
dot com.
Yeah. Well,
Marvelous site.
soccer fans know how to spell Thierry. Thierry Henry was a big soccer player. So thierrycostex.com.
Dot
That's
com.
great. That's good to know. What else?
And I also wanted to mention I think you might have alluded to it, but we didn't really talk about it enough. Another really key important aspect of the shroud is the superficiality of
Yeah.
the image. It resides only on the top, only like 1 to 2 microns deep on the top level. Um, it's there's no way an artist can do that. Now that's one of those things where a skeptic will say, "Oh, that's not true." But from all the things that Stirp said and other people have said over the years, it's very, very superficial, and I think it's just super unlikely um, that any artistic endeavor could do that, because sometimes there might be an uncolored thread or fiber right next to a color fiber,
Yeah.
and I think the superficiality it goes back to the Paulo di Lazzaro thing that a short burst of radiation can penetrate so far and then stop. So I think it seems to be a controlled image formation mechanism, and God can do anything He wants. If He wants to make it stop 1 to 2 microns deep, He can do that. So I think that's another prominent
Well,
plus
that's
for
why the
saying
image
that it's a
that's why the image is so faint. I mean, you can barely see it really
yeah.
with the naked
If you
eye.
get closer than 6 feet, are you going to say that an artist had a 7 foot paintbrush
Yeah.
so he could see the perspective? It doesn't make any sense. It's an expensive cloth. Uh, a forger's not going to use an expensive cloth. He's going to use a piece of rag, and he's going to try to fool as many people as he can. He's going to make it more visible to people. The idea of a forger going to all that trouble fooling 20th and 21st century uh, scientists and surgeons and doctors, it seems absurd to me.
Yeah.
I don't think I don't think it could be done. Um, and the last thing is, um, I have over 100 articles alone on academia.edu,
Yeah.
and I can't remember the URL, but if people write me at that same email address to get that weekly posting, which is jmarino240 at AOL.com. I'll be happy to send them the link to my academia profile, and they could spend the next 5 years of their life or more reading what
Just,
I wrote alone,
yeah,
you
when you
know.
were,
So
so you've done a lot. You've done a lot. I mean, it's remarkable. And are there any projects you have in the future? Is there any other work you're working on at the moment? Any other papers you have planned? Uh, uh, Speaking engagements? Anything we should know?
yeah, a couple of big things going on. Stera is working with a shroud group called Ithonia, which is based in Rome and has a branch in the United States. We're working with them to try to uh, digitize a lot of the archives from some of the big researchers like Barry's collection and then
Yeah,
Ray Rogers' collection and Bob Diniger's collection. And so we're working with them to digitize a lot of the correspondence and documents. All those archives are so interesting. I've been fortunate enough to be able to go through most of them so far. So that's one big project. And then I'm working with a group in St. Louis, my hometown. We're organizing a conference for July 30th through August 3rd. Sorry to say that it's already sold out.
really?
Um, yeah.
Oh my.
Uh,
Okay.
but keep an eye on my weekly posting. If you join that, we'll have information on the follow up for that for being able to access the talks and that sort of thing.
That's
So
great.
I'm really excited about this conference because we're going to have some big names there, and I think it's going to be a dynamite conference. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, Joe, I want to thank you again. This has been a wonderful discussion for me, a fascinating topic, uh, a topic that's endlessly interesting. And are there any final thoughts you have for us, for me?
I would just I would ask people to um, try to do a little research, as Manny said. Try to go to shroud.com. Barry used to say, if you do that, make sure you pack a lunch because you'll be there. Well, when I
Yeah.
used to lecture in St. Louis, when I started lecturing, people would come up to me and say, "Boy, this is an interesting subject. I'd really like to get more into it." And I say, "Be careful. If you get into it, you may never get out." Because I've been doing it 48 years, and it's something that captivated me, and I've seen people studying it 50, 55 years, and it just it really just grabs people's attention. But I get a little upset when people who don't know much about the shroud kind of either say it is authentic or it's not authentic based on their knowledge, which is, sorry to say, in some people's cases, next to nothing.
Yeah.
If you're really interested in the shroud, you're going to have to do a little homework. So I would suggest that you do that homework. Shroud.com is a great place to do it. And my articles are pretty readable. None of them are too technical. And I reference everything. I have footnote, yeah, end notes and other sources to check. If I speculate something about something, I say it's speculation. If it's based on hard evidence, I'll give a reference to it.
Yeah.
But do a little homework and pace yourself.
Well, again, thank you very much. I hope to talk to you again in future and good luck with your conference that's coming up. I'll follow
Thank
that
you.
avidly. And it's been a great pleasure.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
Okay.